Jalen Hurts had overcome a lot of obstacles in the 2023 season, but I do think he deserves more criticism for the Eagles' stretch collapse than he's currently getting. Locked on Eagles, coming your way.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome on in, Eagles fans. I'm Louis DiBiase, host of the Locked On Eagles podcast, Eagles expert also over at Bleacher Report. On today's Locked On Eagles, we continue using the 2023 blame meter, this time featuring quarterback Jalen Hurts. Plus, does Hurts need to be a better leader in 2024? And if the Eagles could do one thing this offseason to help Hurts get back to his 2022 MVP finalist form, what would that be? All that and more on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Eagles. And we thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 back in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. So visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Before I get into the blame meter, right, because we've been doing this over the last few weeks, who's most to blame for the Eagles losing 6 of their last 7 games in the 2023 season? We were talking a lot about head coach Nick Sirianni, offensive coordinator Brian Johnson, the defensive coordinators and Sean Desai and Matt Patricia, general manager Howie Roseman. Now we got to talk about quarterback Jalen Hurts. I want to start by saying what I'm about to say, I do not think means. It's not an indictment on Jalen as the franchise quarterback. I think he is still the guy for the Philadelphia Eagles. I think he's still an elite quarterback. That was not a one-year wonder in 2022. When you look at the 2023 season, he was an MVP favorite through the first 12 weeks of the year. He was the MVP favorite after the Eagles' last big win against the Buffalo Bills in November. He was injured throughout the majority of the year. He carried a really bad coaching staff that he lost total faith in, and a really bad defense to a 10-1 record against some incredible teams. He beat the Dallas Cowboys, the Miami Dolphins, the Kansas City Chiefs, the Buffalo Bills, the Los Angeles Rams, a lot of good playoff teams with elite offenses, quarterbacks, defenses, coaching staffs. He did all of that just this past year, and I don't think he's close to being at the top of the list when it comes to the main reasons for the collapse. But at the same time, I will say, I don't think he deserves to dodge complete blame for those final 7 games, including the playoff loss to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And again, as unfair as it may be for one guy to overcome what the Eagles were going through this year, they had to overcome a lot and eventually could not. Although it's unfair to ask Jalen Hurts to do what they needed him to do to get to, even the divisional round at this point this year, or a division title, let alone a conference championship or a second straight Super Bowl run. Although it might be unfair, that is the job of a player you pay over $200 million to. That is the job of an elite franchise quarterback, is to carry even in some of the most impossible situations. That is why you pay that guy 30% of your salary cap, sometimes more. It's not fair. But guess what? It also wasn't fair to ask Carson Wentz back in 2019 to carry a practice squad level skill position core to a division title, having to win 4 straight games down the stretch. But that's what they needed. That's what Carson did. And Jalen Hurts, he had to be special in the last 7 games. I'm not trying to say that he wasn't good after that Bills game. I thought he was solid against San Francisco. He was not good against Dallas, but I thought he was okay against Seattle considering how sick he was. I thought he was pretty good in that last win against the Giants on Christmas Day. He threw 3 touchdowns against the Arizona Cardinals. He was pretty good. Even former, now offensive coordinator Brian Johnson said that he liked the way Jalen was playing down the stretch in the regular season, but he had to be special. He had to be the player you saw in 2022 and through the first 12 weeks of 2023. And after the 49ers game, he just wasn't that guy anymore. And the circumstances, yes, you can point to the play calling was terrible, the injuries on both sides of the ball, the crap that the defensive line took, and how bad the second and third level of the defense was. But at the same time, those were the circumstances of the first 12 weeks as well. And Jalen Hurts overcame all of that. It wasn't to the extreme that it was the final 7 weeks, but they were 10-1. It's not like they were, 7-3 or, even 8-2 or 6-4. Like they were 6-5. They were 10-1. He was overcoming all of that. Why? Because he was special. Sure, he was still turning the football over at a much higher clip than he did in 2022, but he was special. And that's who they needed him to be. Again, he wasn't terrible. He wasn't so costly that, he was dragging this team down the stretch. It's why I wouldn't put him in the top 3 or 4 reasons the Eagles did collapse in 2023. But that doesn't mean he deserves no blame. Like, he was not the special $200+ million quarterback that he was the first 12 games when they needed it the most. And I don't want to say that he stopped trying to be that guy or he stopped caring, but you really could tell how the demeanor changed with Jalen after I would say it's the Cowboys game. After San Francisco, it still felt a little like, that was one really bad loss, but after the Dallas game, it felt like Jalen lost a little bit of confidence. His energy radiated around the team, and it wasn't a great energy. And that's what the team reflected. The whole team seemed to act that way after the Dallas game. And that's what happens when you're the quarterback and the leader of the locker room. Your energy is going to be the team's energy. Like, you reflect so much off of your team, or a team reflects so much off of a quarterback's energy. And it just felt like Jalen knew the more the season went on and the more his eyes just kind of opened, he started to realize the problems as the weeks went on. Especially, we've been saying it for weeks on this show, the wake-up call for this team was when they lost to San Francisco and Dallas in such dominating fashion that they said, wow, we really aren't as good as we thought we were. And honestly, it felt at times that is what Jalen Hurts thought. You could see it a lot. He was shaking his head as he would come to the sidelines. It was the first time in 3 years that I think he just, for Jalen Hurts, like, he doesn't look as pissed off as others, but he was definitely more emotional in a negative way that we've seen. He wasn't as composed sitting on the bench during that Seattle game or, during the games against the Giants or the Cardinals. He definitely looked rattled a little bit, and that was unlike Jalen. And that's not the guy they needed at the time. So I think he does deserve some blame. Again, he was pretty good down the stretch, but he wasn't special, and they needed their franchise quarterback to be special. Again, I still think Jalen Hurts is an absolute stud. When you look at his advanced stat charts, like, he had the 3rd best accurate percentage to turnover-worthy play percentage ratio without pressure in the entire league. He was 2nd best in the middle of the field when it comes to his passing EPA over the last 2 years, including 2023. It was him and Tua. Like, Jalen Hurts, when he threw over the middle, when it comes to his accurate percentage of throws compared to turnover-worthy plays, was one of the highest ratios in the league when he was not blitzed. Like, that's Jalen Hurts. He was still a really good quarterback this year that surpassed 4,000 scrimmage yards and had 36 total touchdowns. That was a guy that, again, was an MVP favorite through more than half of the year. But again, in a vacuum, when we're talking about just those final 7 games, he needed to be better. Again, I don't think he was terrible, but he wasn't special. And sometimes, as unfair as it may be to ask of one guy, even at the quarterback position, this is why you pay this position so much. This is why everything revolves around this spot, because this is the one position that, even in the situation the Eagles were in down the stretch, a lot of the times those quarterbacks can overcome those situations. We've seen it in Philadelphia. We've seen it with Carson Wentz. Heck, we've seen it with Jalen Hurts. We saw it this year, but he just could not sustain that level of play that he did through the first 11 games. And a lot of that is not his fault. A lot of it is exterior factors. A lot of it's health as well and circumstance. But the fact of the matter was, he wasn't as good as he was early on when they needed him the most down the stretch. One thing I do think, though, even if you disagree with what I'm talking about, one thing I think we can agree on is whoever was spreading this information through all these stories about Jalen Hurts being a bad leader, I think they're completely wrong. And we'll get into that coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL regular season is officially over. The NFL playoffs are almost over. We're in the final 4 of the conference championships. There's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 back in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 back in bonus bets, win or lose. So for me, I'm going to go with some money line bets. I'm taking the Baltimore Ravens to overcome a lot of odds here and beat Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs in the AFC title. I think it's Lamar's year to get a ring, and how sweet would that be if he got one before the likes of Joe Burrow and Josh Allen, considering the national narratives. I'm a diehard Lamar Jackson fan. I want to see Lamar get a ring. In the NFC, I'm going money line, San Francisco 49ers. I want Detroit, but I do think the Niners at home get it done, and they play Baltimore in the big game. You can bet on so much at FanDuel. The app is so easy to use. You can do live same-game parlays. You can find bets in the new Explore tab. You can make a parlay in the Parlay Hub, the best way to find popular parlays. All that and more. Like I said, money line bets, anytime touchdown scores, you name it, it's all there. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup. FanDuel, the official partner of the NFL. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, want to let you know that Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. So go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. Was Jalen Hurts a bad leader in 2023? There have been multiple stories with sources and anonymous quotes from supposedly inside the building saying that Jalen Hurts needed to be a better leader this year, especially down the stretch when the Eagles lost 6 of their last 7 games. We've seen articles from the Philadelphia Inquirer. We've seen it from Bleeding Green Nation, although the writer of that piece has been known to write quote-unquote hit pieces. So you know who I'm talking about if you read the stories back in the day when Carson Wentz was the quarterback. We saw it also from ESPN. Like there was a lot out there about the vibe inside the Eagles locker room and who's to blame, finger pointing, and some of it went back to Jalen Hurts and specifically about his leadership skills. And I'm not saying these reporters are making this up like that. They didn't hear this from anybody and they're doing this just for clicks. I do think some people inside that building maybe felt that way. I honestly used to feel this about Jalen Hurts back when he was Carson Wentz's backup. His stoic demeanor, like his silence and just his overall confidence, which is not a bad thing to have if you're Jalen. It's part of what makes him great. But I thought when he was a backup, it could come across misinterpretably so, but some people could see that as arrogant, and maybe that's not as receptive, especially when things are bad. If he's not as vocal, he's not as energetic, maybe he thinks that, some people might think that Jalen thinks it's other people's fault. It's not on him what's going on inside the building. So I'm not saying that some people inside the NovaCare do not believe that that's the case, but I don't believe it's a majority of people, players, coaches, front office members alike. A lot of the things that we heard Jalen getting critiqued about when it comes to his leadership style, last year we were talking about was why these were attributes of Jalen's that made him, what I said on the show, was the greatest leader at the quarterback position in Eagles history. And now these traits are being used to make him sound like he was almost a locker room cancer in 2023. And that's just so not true. Like, sure, could Jalen be a little more energetic when the Eagles are losing? Could he be a little more vocal at times? Yeah, absolutely. But I think the extreme that these articles are taking it to, where they're saying this is what makes him a selfish, bad leader, is just not true. And I think this is what happened a lot when Carson Wentz was the quarterback too, in a lot of those articles. Like Jalen Hurts, when you talk about how he never gets too high or he never gets too low, like he's always trying to stay even keel during a game, after a game, for press conferences, throughout the week with preparation. Like that was seen as a good thing. And now it's like he gets criticized for being quiet on the field or being level-headed when he's on the bench. Like him never being satisfied when he talks about, the standard and all that. That's something now that people criticize about Jalen. But we said last year that's what makes him like the Kobe Bryants of the world in sports. Like it's a rare breed that you don't see as much in sports anymore. That's what makes Jalen. And I don't know why now suddenly that's a bad thing just because the Eagles were losing games. And we've also, by the way, seen Jalen Hurts be pretty emotional. Like, you look at the game against the Commanders when he had that go-ahead passing touchdown late in the fourth quarter to A.J. Brown. Like, you could hear, did you not see him screaming on the field and, bashing heads with Lane Johnson because he was that pumped up? Like, we've seen him before games, like around the huddle, giving great speeches. We've heard some awesome speeches of Jalen inside the locker room. I just don't know how in a calendar year things flipped so fast where he was seen as an elite leader. He was an elite quarterback at the podium. He was a lead by example guy. He always had the right things to say. He carried himself with such confidence and maturity. Like, he was a quote unquote coach's son. Like, this was a good thing, especially for the quarterback position. We used to say this is what Carson Wentz, I didn't say this specifically, but people used to praise Jalen and say this is what Carson Wentz was always missing, was Jalen's leadership style. And now suddenly, who are these anonymous sources, because they're cowards and won't put their name to it, that are bashing the franchise quarterback? It's just so frustrating to see multiple times now in Eagles history, in the last 7 years, the last 5 years, where the minute this team goes through any sort of adversity, people inside that building, and again, I don't know who it is. It might be players that know they're on the outs or coaches that know they're going to get fired and they need to point fingers at the quarterback or the coach or the GM, so it might save their butt. I don't know if that's what it is, but it's so frustrating that anytime things go wrong, stories just always come out that just bash the franchise quarterback. Quarterbacks in Philadelphia just get piled up on in the city. And I'm not saying that it's never justified. I think there was some truth to a lot of those stories with Carson Wentz, but I think there's always an extreme that things go to, and most of the time it's just not true. It's not the majority belief inside that building. Like, yes, again, Jalen Hurts, his body language, as I said in segment 1, his body language at the end of the year was not great. He lost faith in the coaching staff, especially Nick Sirianni and Brian Johnson. He lost confidence. He was not healthy either. He probably felt like he couldn't do things like he did in 2022. But why do we always have to do this? Like, yes, Jalen Hurts isn't perfect. He should be criticized. I just criticized him for an entire segment to say that, he wasn't good enough down the stretch in the final 2 months of the season. But why do we have to take it to these extremes where suddenly we just erase everything that we've ever thought we've known about a guy, or we turn positives, things that we said were positives, into negatives to form this new narrative? Like, I don't know. The fact that people think Jalen Hurts is a bad leader now, I think is asinine. I don't think he was good enough on the field this year. I don't think he was so bad in the locker room. And again, we don't know. None of us were inside. We truly don't know. Maybe he was this complete jerk that wasn't as good of a leader as he was last year. Maybe things changed. I'm not sure, but I have a hard time believing in a calendar year he suddenly went from an elite leader to a terrible one. And Jalen was actually asked this question last week, or his final press conference of the year, and he said himself that he thought a lot of the things people criticized him about this year were what made him great, which was what we've been saying on this podcast for so many years. So I think that part of Jalen's criticism that he's getting right now in the offseason, because there was another piece that just came out through SB Nation's blog, Bleeding Green Nation, that had a lot of aggressive quotes about Hurts and his leadership style that I don't know who's saying this, but I can't imagine it's a lot of the core of this Eagles team, or I think you would know that for sure. Outside of, and I want to talk more about Jalen Hurts coming up next, outside of getting play caller right, which I think is so important to get Jalen back to who he was in 2022 and the first 12 weeks of 2023, there is another key thing I think the Eagles have to do on offense to get Hurts back to that MVP level. So I'll get into that coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is fast and the easiest way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. And right now, all users get $100 off when you buy a big game ticket with the code Vegas100. So if you're going to the big game, get it through Game Time and use Vegas100, the promo code, to get $100 off your tickets. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. You can see the view from your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. All-in prices show your total up front, so you know you're getting a great deal before you check out. You can buy tickets in seconds with just to tap. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Like I said, Game Time users are getting $100 off a big game ticket with the code Vegas100. Terms do apply. Just download the Game Time app and use the code Vegas100 for $100 off a big game ticket. Or if you're not going to the game, use the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase of any other ticket. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, how do we get Jalen Hurts back to his 2022 form in 2024? Not even just his 2022 form, but the guy we saw through the first 12 weeks of 2023 that was, from FanDuel, a betting favorite, the betting favorite to win MVP. After he led that double-digit comeback and scored 5 touchdowns in the second half against Josh Allen and the Buffalo Bills, Jalen Hurts was the MVP favorite. That was this year. So I don't want to say when I word it as Jalen, how do we get him back to 2022? I don't want that to mean I think Jalen had this Carson Wentz 2020 like regression this year, or he completely plummeted where he has all this progress he needs to make. He has this far way to go to get back to who he was. Like, that's not the case at all. He was elite through the majority of this year. As I said in the show, he was not nearly good enough in the 7 final games of the year. I would say 6 of the last 7, because I thought he was pretty good against the Giants in that last win they had. But, you know, the fact of the matter is that he's got some work to do to get back. It's not a significant amount, but he's not ending the year on a good note. So how do we get the Eagles to get Jalen Hurts back to his MVP level? To me, there's one, obviously the main thing is getting a new play caller, right? Getting play caller right. Whether that's Nick Sirianni taking back over and, you know, finding a way to be better in that way than he was in 2021, whether it's, I don't know, because Brian Johnson's out now. So it's, I don't know, is it Frank Reich? Is it they're interviewing Cliff Kingsbury, which I don't love, but is it Gerard Johnson from the Houston Texans? Is it Jim Bob Cooter from the Indianapolis Colts? Regardless, they need to get that right. Like, that is the number one priority. But I think something else that's very important to help Jalen Hurts is to get this run game back to being dominant like it was in 2021 and 2022. And I'm not saying that Jalen Hurts needs the Eagles offense to be a run-first team because he cannot carry them as a passer. I'm not saying that at all. But I think the Eagles need to be dominant in the run again, because it's what makes Jalen so dangerous, is his dual threat ability as a passer and a runner. And because, number one, they need to get him healthy and get him back to being a dominant running quarterback, but they also need to be better in the run game as a whole when it comes to the offensive line and the running backs, because the offensive line this year, DeAndre Swift, Kenneth Gainwell, Boston Scott, they were not good enough compared to the likes of Miles Sanders in the 2022 run game or the 2021 run game. Like, they were not dominant. They had some dominant games, Minnesota and Tampa Bay early on in the year. I thought they had a good game against the Chiefs on the ground, the first Giants game on Christmas Day, but it wasn't nearly as consistent as it was. And defenses knew it. It made the Eagles pretty one-dimensional, and I think that really Hurts. I think it really damaged the offense, and I think Jalen knows, because the report was in that ESPN story from Tim McManus, that Jalen was not happy with how aggressive and deep ball reliant the Eagles offense was. Like, he wanted to get back to running the football, utilizing the middle of the field, being more balanced, taking what a defense gives you. And I think that's why he had so much success in 2022 with deep shots, is because the run game was so dominant. The middle of the field was an area that they attacked with A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, and Dallas Goedert, and you did not see enough of that this year. They were very one-dimensional, and I think they need to get back to, again, they need to be a pass-first offense. I think every team in the NFL needs to be. But when you dial up that run game, I'm not saying I need them to run more, but when they run, it needs to be much more efficient than it was this year to help Jalen. And again, because he's a dual threat, you need the defense to respect that area of this unit. And this past year, they did not. And it was a combination of how inconsistent Swift and the offensive line was on the ground, but also how hurt Jalen was and how limited he was as a mobile quarterback. Like, yeah, sure, he still put up numbers. He broke the record for most rushing touchdowns in a single season for a quarterback and still had, over 500 rushing yards. But we all saw it. It wasn't as explosive as it was in 2022. You weren't seeing the chunk 15 to 20-yard runs at times. You were seeing if there was a 7-yard hole, Jalen was getting 7 yards, but he wasn't getting the extra 7 to 8 that he would last year. So I think getting back to a dominant run game is going to be really crucial for this offense next year. And maybe you look at some free agents because DeAndre Swift is a free agent. Do they go out there and sign a Derrick Henry? I doubt it. Do they go out there and sign a Saquon Barkley? I doubt it. Could you get, though, like a Josh Jacobs on a 1 or 2 year deal if the running back market's as bad as it's been over the last few years? Like, can you find a way to get one of these great talents on a bargain because they want to come to a contender because they can't really cash in, which pretty much no running backs can anymore? I don't know. Like, is that the way to get the run game back to being dominant? If not, and let's say you bring back DeAndre Swift on a 1 year deal or a 2 year deal, or you try a similar strategy as last year where you try to trade for another guy, like another DeAndre Swift type that's, another team doesn't want to pay and you only have to trade a late round pick for it, or, you try that idea. Either way, if that's the move, you have to get better. You need a better committee, I think, too. Way better than last year. Like, if you bring back DeAndre Swift, I don't think Swift can be even the workhorse that Miles Sanders was in 2022. You need a better RB2 than Kenneth Gainwell. I think even, honestly, you need a better third guy than Boston Scott. If you're going to bring back DeAndre Swift, I want to do something like 2017 where you have a Jay Ajayi, you have a LeGarrette Blount, you have a Corey Clement. So they need a better committee. They need more consistent running backs. And again, I think Swift was a very explosive player last year that had some huge games for this team. He had over 1,000 yards. But if they, again, don't go get like a Josh Jacobs or a, Derrick Henry type, and I doubt that this team would do that. They never take that route with Howie Roseman as general manager. I do think they need, for Jalen Hurts' sake, they need some more talent at running back. And the offensive line has to be better on the ground. It's going to be easier said than done likely without Jason Kelce, right? Cam Jurgens moving over to center, likely Tyler Steen at right guard. It's going to be a much younger offensive line, but I think that's crucial. Again, play calling is number one. Getting that right is huge for Jalen. But the other thing to get him back to his peak form is a dominant run game that also does include him being an elite rusher. How do they do that? Want to hear from you guys as well. Let us know on Twitter at LockedOnBirds, at DiBiase, LOE. We've got more shows, though, for you this week. 3 more. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. But for now, I'm going to sign off. Louis DiBiase right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, thank you for downloading. Thank you for watching and listening. And let's go, Birds.